1920. There was a lot going on at the start of the decade. The world was still recovering from the First World War. The lingering effects of the Treaty of Versailles had a polarizing effect among countries, as did the formation of the League of Nations. In America, women had just been legally granted the right to vote with the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1919, freeing up some 26 million women to participate in national politics. The Volstead Act had just gone into effect, making the production of alcohol illegal for, at this point, an unknown length of time. All of these things and more were important events in politics all at the same time, and America was on its way up, in the sphere of global political importance. I'm not really well versed in politics, but I spent many hours doing research and writing the script for this video, and I'll do my best to present it. So, let's get started. The incumbent president, Woodrow Wilson, despite having recently been almost entirely incapacitated by a severe stroke in October 1919, still wanted to run for a third term. You see, at this point, running for a third term was entirely possible, though no one had yet succeeded in doing so. It had simply been a political courtesy to retire after 2 terms as president, a precedent set by George Washington. Perhaps this angered some, but there were far more important factors that worked against Wilson. First, he was never formally nominated as his own party realized that he didn't stand a chance, especially in his condition. Speaking of that, let's go back to the stroke. Wilson had been debilitated by the stroke so badly that his doctors discovered that it affected his judgment and impulse control. Not exactly something you would want in a leader. For months, Wilson's wife, Edith, worked behind the scenes, serving as the president's contact with the outside world and politics in general. And she was able to exercise quite a bit of control in this position. She had so much influence at this time that she is considered to have been the closest America has come to having a woman as president. But information of Wilson's condition and his wife's important role were kept secret for months, and was not released to the public until February of 1920. By the time the election was ramping up, Wilson had recovered enough, but he still wasn't as strong as he had been, and this might not have been the first stroke he'd had. It is believed that he had a smaller stroke all the way back in 1906. Aside from his health, let's take a look at some other things about Wilson. He had supported women's suffrage, which was achieved with the adoption of the 19th Amendment on the eve of the election in August 1920. But he had done little to endear himself to immigrants, specifically German and Irish immigrants, 2 of the biggest groups. He hadn't done much to protect German Americans from being discriminated against during the First World War, something that understandably caused resentment among them. And while Wilson had supported Irish independence from Great Britain during the war, he also would have had to denounce anti-British attacks. But because Great Britain was one of his most important allies in the war, he didn't. And many Irish Americans thought that he hadn't done enough to protect Ireland's interests in the Treaty of Versailles, and that he didn't support Irish independence strongly enough. Because many Irish Americans still identified very closely with their homeland, Wilson's pro-British attitude upset many of them. And the large number of Irish Americans was almost completely alienated from the Democratic Party because of their attitude toward Wilson. The same can be said, to a slightly lesser extent, of German Americans. Wilson's political unsuitability for a third term was summarized by his former Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. The president attempted to drive out of public life every Democrat who dared differ from him, even in minute details, while he made no effort to strengthen the Democrats who made him the keeper of their conscience. He alienated all Republican support and invited partisan opposition by his appeal, just before the election of 1918, for a Congress that would support his personal leadership. And then, though knowing full well that the majority of the nation was against him, he refused to deal with the Senate as a coordinate branch of the government. By thus preventing ratification, the president assumed responsibility for the nation's failure to enter the League, and thrust the League into the campaign as a partisan issue. The people, confronted with the choice between presidential infallibility and respect for the opinion of the majority of the Senate, naturally chose the latter. Okay, now that we've established the context of the current mood toward Wilson, let's move on to Harding. Presidential hopeful Warren G. Harding promised a return to normalcy from all the political craziness in the aftermath of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. This appealed much more strongly to the Irish and German immigrants that now disdained Wilson, as well as millions of other Americans who just wanted peace. Harding actively tried to appeal to the average person, which is evident in his front porch campaign, where he didn't travel all around the country trying to win over supporters, and instead had people come to him at his own front porch in his hometown of Marion, Ohio. When people showed up, he made a speech. This strategy tried to carve out a small-town family man sort of image. He even went so far as to make his own house his campaign headquarters. And as a bonus, he was considered very handsome, and he would be labeled as looking presidential. Perhaps this was a conscious thought on the part of the Republican campaign. After all, this would be the first election with female voters, and perhaps some thought that would give Harding an edge, but that's just speculation. Harding's hometown of Marion, Ohio hosted the throngs of people that came down that way to hear the candidate speak. The townspeople held barbecues and parades and provided a massive amount of extra lodging and food for the influx of visitors. In the 3 months that Harding's campaign lasted, more than 600,000 people had come to Marion, a town with a population of only 29,000. Harding was very sociable and easy to talk to, and this was very appealing to normal people tired of high-strung intellectual types like Wilson. Harding appeared to be more representative of them, the average Joe, not the elite. He also didn't propose to make any radical changes like Wilson dreamed of. This went perfectly in line with his vague proposal of a return to normalcy. And he was also an ideal compromise candidate for the more progressive Republicans. Harding had not been considered a major Republican nominee at first, but somehow he was able to sneak his way in, but this was due to forces out of his control. The same could somewhat be said of Calvin Coolidge, though he was still enjoying increased popularity after his handling of the Boston police strike in 1919. It was especially surprising that Harding was selected because he had not performed well in the Ohio and Indiana primaries, held before the Republican National Convention. Ohio was his home state, which almost all candidates rely on to be supportive, so it seemed as if he would be quickly eliminated from the race. Harding even made a tentative decision to quit politics entirely. It was only after long discussions among party bosses that they surprisingly decided to choose him as their man. The Republican Party's official platform statement accused Wilson and the Democratic administration for not having been properly prepared for the United States' entry into World War I, and that this, quote, directly resulted in unnecessary losses to our gallant troops, end quote. It also criticized the Wilson administration's handling of the transition to peacetime. This excerpt further explains this stance. While the country has been left to shift for itself, the government has continued on a wartime basis. The administration has not demobilized the army of placeholders. It continued a method of financing the period of Reconstruction. It has used legislation passed to meet the emergency of war to continue its arbitrary and inquisitorial control over the life of the people in time of peace, and to carry confusion into industrial life. Among other issues, they also expressed their support for farmers, who probably didn't associate with Wilson's intellectual ideas very strongly anyway. And of course, their statement also addresses economic and trade issues, but these are placed after the previously mentioned issues of the transition to peacetime as well as the Treaty of Versailles, so that is probably a sign of where they wanted to place their emphasis. I'm sure many of you have been told by a speech teacher or English teacher that your most important points should be at the beginning and the end of the speech or essay because they will leave a bigger impression than what's in the middle, and that's what's going on here. All of the boring, tedious financial matters are included smack in the middle of the platform statement, while post-war recovery takes the beginning, since it was a very important issue that many people had varying opinions about. And the end was reserved for immigration and the League of Nations, both of which were much more important talking points for average Americans. But essentially, the Republican statement throws punch after punch at the Democrats for their perceived wrongdoings during the Wilson administration. So let's go over to the Democrats. Harding's Democratic opponent was James M. Cox, coincidentally also from Ohio and was actually its current governor at the time. His running mate was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, someone we'll hear a bit more from a decade or two later. Cox made many of the same mistakes as Wilson in terms of policy, and supported many of the same things. A progressive liberal, Cox, like Wilson, believed in internationalism, which is pretty much the same thing as globalization, and supported the formation of the League of Nations, though more hesitantly than Wilson. And, like Wilson, he had not endeared himself to German Americans, and had supported policies that had limited all things German during the First World War. Even though America had not been as physically affected by the First World War as most European countries had been, many Americans were tired of talk about the war. They didn't want to get mixed up with Europe's problems, even for the sake of democracy. Instead, many wanted to focus on their own country. The issue of the League of Nations was one of the biggest talking points of the election. Although the idea for the League was Wilson's, the US Senate voted not to join in November 1919, though many liberals wanted to get the US into the League. Without the United States, with its increasing power, the League's international authority would be severely weakened. In fact, in the Democratic Party's official platform statement, the issue of the League was put front and center. If you recall a few minutes ago in the Republican platform statement, the first issues they listed were about the Democrats' mismanagement of the war effort and the peacetime transition. The order of these issues really shows what they wanted to be their main selling point in the election. Of course, the Democratic statement goes through the same financial, economic, and trade issues as the Republican one did. But one very important thing is that they supported Wilson's action in the war and the peace talks, and really his administration in general. This is important because, as we know, many Americans grew to dislike Wilson's handling of the immediate post-war period. By sticking with Wilson, the Democrats certainly did little to win over Democratic voters who were unhappy with Wilson, and virtually no chance of winning over voters from the other side. Another, smaller reason why the Democrats lost votes in the election was the Socialist Party. Although it didn't have a chance of winning, the Socialist Party did bring in over 3% of the popular vote, which would have come exclusively from liberal voters, who almost definitely would have voted Democrat if they had to choose between the two main parties. But of course, it's not an easy decision to disown an outgoing president from your own party. If they had disowned Wilson, that could have easily delegitimized the party in the eyes of many Democratic voters, which would have been disastrous for them. So they did what they thought would do the most damage control. Though the Cox campaign did try to distance itself from Wilson a bit, many in the public believed Wilson was controlling Cox from behind the scenes, something that frustrated Cox to no end. As I've said a few times already, the issue of the League of Nations was an important one, probably the most important one. Some of the arguments for not joining the League, other than getting involved in overseas disputes, was to solve domestic issues. One of the big reasons for this was the recent terrorist bombings throughout the US, which were part of the first Red Scare. These attacks culminated in the bombing of Wall Street that killed 40 people, and for which no one was ever arrested for. There had also been massive labor strikes in 1919, including the Seattle General Strike in January, the May Day riots in May, a steel strike in September, a coal strike in November, as well as the Boston police strike in September, where Calvin Coolidge had earned a good reputation for his handling of the situation as the governor of Massachusetts. And on top of that, there was racial violence, the worst of it being in Chicago in the summer. With all of this going on within such a short time span, it's easy to understand why some people felt they needed to focus on their own country before, or instead of, helping other countries with their problems thousands of miles away. Next, let's talk about a few smaller factors that influenced the election. Newspapers continued to be very important political tools. Democrats alleged, not too inaccurately, that an easy majority of the newspapers were Republican, and they also accused the papers of bashing and slandering the Democratic Party and biasing voters throughout the campaign. A smaller issue that featured a bit in the election was prohibition. The Volstead Act had only recently been implemented, and while neither candidate pushed the issue too hard, it was widely believed that Harding was dry and Cox was wet. Perhaps it didn't hurt Harding too much, since the failures of the enforcement of prohibition were not yet seen and remained in the future. Though it should be noted that Harding was not personally against alcohol. He himself drank a lot. It was purely a political move. But Cox being considered a wet candidate probably isolated him from many of the new women voters, the demographic that had largely led the push for prohibition, and they were more likely to have put more emphasis on that specific issue. In reality, Cox said he didn't consider prohibition to be as relevant of an issue than more pressing matters across the Atlantic, so his stance on prohibition wasn't too clear. Now, you might be thinking that prohibition was on the minds of many voters, and that's definitely true. Behind the scenes of the Democratic Party especially, the issue of prohibition was more divisive. They developed a non-committal platform stance of moist, to be purposely vague so as not to isolate voters on the fence. According to a New York Times article from September 14th, when asked about prohibition, Cox stopped his address to reply that the prohibition issue was as dead as slavery, and that as governor of Ohio, he had enforced the laws. By doing this, Cox was trying to put more attention and focus on the League of Nations question. Another important demographic was black voters. As you can see in this map, it was actually the South that typically voted more Democratic at that time. Politics was a little bit flip-flopped back then.
The Republicans were the party of Lincoln, the man who had freed the slaves. So, naturally, black slaves that had been emancipated had historically voted almost exclusively for the Republicans, and passed that along to the younger generation. And as many would also point out, the Democrats had been the ones who had historically fought to keep the institution of slavery.
And let's also not forget that Wilson was from Virginia, a southern state, and had been the first southern president elected since the end of the Civil War, and that meant more than it might seem.
Because of the Democrats' popularity in the South, and black Americans' tendency to vote Republican, this led to widespread intimidation and an unofficial large-scale disenfranchisement of black voters in the South, which was really ramped up in the previous decade, and a staggering amount of black votes went uncounted. However, for the black Americans that did vote, by this time, many were not so much voting for the Republicans as they were voting against the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson was not especially popular among black voters, who believed he had done little to advance racial equality, and Wilson had in fact approved laws favoring segregation.
This decrease of enthusiasm for the Republicans was due to the fact that the Republican Party's dedication to racial equality had stagnated, partly due to a push to win over more Southern voters. The Republicans didn't completely disown this belief, but they pushed it to the back of their priority list. Here's a quote taken from The Crisis, a popular black periodical. "Some of us no longer believe in the Republican Party, but we believe far less in the Democrats. We face a situation in which our friends are in general passivity for us, but our enemies are always violently against us. For instance, the South is consistent in its opposition to us. It is passionate and murderous in defense of its traditions of white domination and black serfdom. These traditions dominate the political life. It has pushed past the frontiers of what is lawful and just, making null and void the Constitution. Yet, the Republican North is silent." Radio also became a component of presidential elections for the first time, though not an important one. Station KDKA-AM in Pittsburgh read off the election results, the first time that was ever done on radio. Although that station had a very good range for the time, the number of Americans who owned radios was still very small. Only a small number of people would have heard it. Radio didn't have nearly as much of an impact like it would in the next decade, so this is more of an interesting footnote than a real factor. The number of voters in the 1920 election increased by 8 million compared with the previous election in 1916. On November 2nd, the results came in. The results of the 1920 election were pretty shocking. Harding and Coolidge had won with a huge majority in the popular vote as well as the Electoral College. Harding had received 60.3% of the popular vote against Cox's 34.1%, but the disparity was even worse in the electoral vote. Harding received 404 votes, while Cox received a measly 127. The Democratic popular vote had stagnated and showed little increase from the last election, but the Republican popular vote doubled in the 1920 election. Strangely enough, of the 4 men running for president and vice president, only Cox would not become president in the future. Poor guy. But his running mate, Franklin D. Roosevelt, would recover very quickly from such a bad loss, and became one of the most important presidents in American history. But Cox ended up living far longer than the other 3, all the way until 1957, so I guess you could say things didn't turn out completely bad for him in the end. For comparison, Harding died in 1923, Coolidge died in 1933, and FDR died in 1945. So, to summarize, the Democrats were at a disadvantage from the start because of Woodrow Wilson's recent unpopularity, and Cox was dealt a very bad hand by his party. Harding was successful because he wanted to move away from international affairs that many blamed Wilson for getting involved with in the first place, and this meant not making radical changes and focusing more on domestic issues.
The Democratic Party was a bit out of touch with what the people wanted, and didn't cater enough to their desires. The Republicans did. They promised something that so many people wanted, a return to normalcy.
Each campaign had completely opposite strategies. The Democrats had traveled around the country at a dizzying pace, while the Republicans had taken a more sedentary approach. The biggest issues of the election, by far, were the League of Nations and post-war Reconstruction, which included the effects of the Treaty of Versailles. It has been said by some political historians that James M. Cox was the best major presidential candidate that didn't win. And boy did he not win. But not much of this was his fault, really. The atmosphere was not right for another progressive president at that time, and the results of the election really showed that. But will the United States really make a return to normalcy under the new administration as Harding promised? Stay tuned to find out. I really hope you enjoyed this video because I worked really hard on it. I spent so long doing research into the issues and the background, but I really only touched the surface. Presidential campaigns are always extremely complicated, but I wanted to keep this fairly concise. This ended up being my second longest documentary video yet, I think, and it took the most amount of time to research, so hopefully it was still easy to follow. If you want to take an even deeper dive into this election, there's a very detailed book that I used for research titled The Road to Normalcy: The Presidential Campaign and Election of 1920 by Wesley Marvin Bagby, which you can borrow at the Internet Archive at archive.org if you have an account, which is free by the way. This book especially goes into how President Harding was nominated in the first place, because it's a long series of party meetings that I didn't really want to focus on too much since it's pretty mundane. You can also find more contemporary coverage on the election in the Current History magazine issues for 1920, which include the platform statements of the two major parties. I'll leave the links in the description for both of those. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.